Union Pacific's Big Boy stood as the giant that tamed America's mountains. Yet, as the 1950s arrived, its time was running out. Then came an experimental locomotive billed as the next great leap. Boasting 8,500 horsepower, jet-age engineering, plus a joint venture linking Union Pacific with General Electric, it is a machine that hardly anyone recalls today. It has been forgotten. If it was built to render steam legends obsolete, how did it slip so completely out of the historical record? The answer lays bare the high-stakes wager and quiet collapse behind the greatest what-if in American railroading. Across the high plains and the rugged mountain passes of the American West, the big boy locomotives of Union Pacific once ruled. Every one of these engines ran past 132 feet and weighed over 600 tons. Riding on a 488 four-wheel setup and famed for sheer power, the big boy could haul freight across Sherman Hill and the Wasatch Range in places where weaker locomotives ground to a halt. But as the 1940s drew to a close, the steam era began to show its fault lines. Even the big boy, legendary and rated at 6,000 horsepower, had become a liability. Keeping these iron giants fed and moving took a small army each run: firemen, engineers, machinists, and boilermakers. Stops for coal and water never let up, and every trip meant hours of servicing back at the roundhouse. As labor deals expanded and fuel crept higher, yearly costs climbed. In one shift alone, a single big boy devoured 16 tons of coal along with thousands of gallons of water. With crew lists swelling, the railroad's finances buckled under the weight of tradition. Meanwhile, diesel-electric locomotives were edging in from the east. The new machines offered fewer failures and could roll for days without serious servicing. Gone were the water towers, gone the firemen, and far fewer crew were needed on board. Still, the earliest diesels couldn't rival the big boy's raw brawn, especially across the punishing grades and vast distances that shaped Union Pacific's main line. In the Omaha boardrooms, the figures spelled out a blunt reality. The great days of steam were coming to an end, and the big boy, lately the fleet's crown jewel, had come to embody a system teetering on the edge. A fork in the road faced Union Pacific's leaders. Keep feeding money into a dying age, or bet everything on something wholly new. What hung in the balance went beyond horsepower to the survival of a railroad empire founded on innovation. So began the hunt for a true successor, not just a locomotive, but a future capable of outrunning the past. Union Pacific's post-war president, A.E. Stoddard, had no intention of simply going along with the crowd. To him, the railroad's road ahead looked bold and expansive, where one locomotive might master the western grades with muscle exceeding anything steam or diesel had yet produced. As the 1950s opened, Union Pacific approached General Electric, a firm brimming with jet engine know-how, for an answer that would vault clear over the slow gains of diesel electrics. The project's lead engineer at General Electric, Frank Kowalewski, called the opening proposal nothing short of a revolution on rails. Rather than coupling several diesel units together, General Electric pledged one sleek machine driven by a gas turbine, built on the very principles already reshaping aviation. Inked in the early 1950s, the contract demanded a prototype that would break through the ceilings of steam. The first designs opened at 4,500 horsepower, impressive on its own. Yet, the true ambitions still lay down the road. As the decade closed, the engineering crews set their sights on a staggering 8,500 horsepower in one unit, a number that would leave the big boy looking ordinary. Horsepower alone wasn't the point of this partnership. Stoddard and his people were after a locomotive that could streamline operations, trim the moving parts, and shrink crew needs to a minimum. General Electric's engineers came back with a bold picture: a turbine electric able to drag the heaviest freight over the Rockies on one throttle and a sliver of the manpower. The turbine's jet age allure proved impossible to resist, holding out not just brute strength, but a fresh era of efficiency and polish for the Union Pacific main line. The era's press notices heralded a transformative jump, as General Electric and Union Pacific billed the turbine as the single most powerful locomotive on Earth. When the prototype showed up, it drew crowds and press coverage, and technical journals hummed over that 8,500 horsepower figure, which on paper buried its steam and diesel rivals. Around the industry, the Union Pacific and General Electric alliance became a badge of American ambition, a bet that one daring move could untangle the railroad's thorniest problems. Wasting no time, General Electric's marketing team cast the gas turbine as tomorrow's locomotive. Their brochures shone with artwork of sleek engines cutting across the prairie, freight cars streaming endlessly behind. Jet-age economy for the nation's railroads, ran the banner promise. Trade publications seized on the tagline, and soon the turbine was hailed as the atomic age's first genuine railroad product. General Electric's promotional push leaned heavily on the vocabulary of progress. Full-page advertisements likened the new locomotive's turbine to the power plants behind jet bombers and commercial airliners. The pitch was plain. Before long, Union Pacific's main line would thrum with the same technology that had mastered the sky. White-coated engineers posed beside looming turbine assemblies, while executives talked up a future of trains going faster, farther, and on less fuel than ever. Trade literature of the day crowed that the turbine electric could squeeze out more power for every pound than any steam or diesel running the rails. Fact sheets advertised a 4,500 horsepower rating, with a doubling supposedly on the way, and promised unbeatable efficiency fed by a steady supply of surplus bunker C oil. The General Electric copywriters framed that fuel as a secret advantage, an oil boom leftover destined to push costs lower and profits higher. The optimism carried straight into Union Pacific's own press notices. Their statements vowed that one new turbine could stand in for several locomotives, cutting labor bills and streamlining operations. Nearly every bulletin carried the word revolutionary. In Omaha, railroad brass laid on luncheons and tours for reporters keen to see the shining prototype and its space-age cab. All the excitement crested when the first production unit was revealed. Photos of the debut filled the newspapers. Onlookers massed at trackside while technical journals wondered aloud about a dawning era of jet-powered freight. Hopes ran high, stoked by pledges of jet-age speed paired with jet-age savings. Briefly, it looked as though the future had genuinely pulled in on steel rails. One frigid December morning in 1953, Union Pacific's brand-new gas turbine electric locomotive roared up Sherman Hill on its maiden run. Railroad men and executives looked on as the turbine's exhaust thundered into the Wyoming sky. Nothing like that sound had ever rung through those canyons. According to local papers, the train topped the grade quicker than any steam engine ever had, dragging behind it a load fully 400 tons heavier than the big boy usually pulled. For an instant, the future seemed to land in one screaming blast of power. That day's field logs set down the figures proudly. The turbine's 4,500 horsepower more than answered the mountain, and engineers called the cab uncannily smooth, almost airplane-like, the throttle snapping to every command. At an average of 40 miles per hour, the train crested Sherman Hill, outpacing the last steam generation. Freight supervisors observed that one turbine could shoulder loads that had once demanded two big boys paired up. Union Pacific's leaders watched their gamble come good, while General Electric's engineers soaked in the shine of a technical win. But underneath all the elation, the earliest signs of trouble surfaced in the fuel ledgers. What the turbine drank in bunker C oil was astonishing. On that first run, the logs show it burning somewhere between 14 and 17 gallons of fuel per mile traveled, close to 3 times a comparable diesel's rate and well beyond anything General Electric's brochures had projected. The fuel itself posed a headache. As thick as tar at room temperature, Bunker C had to be warmed past 200 degrees before it would so much as flow to the turbine. Watching the gauges and fuel lines as intently as the throttle, crews stayed alert for clogs that might strand the engine out in the middle of nowhere. For those riding the cab, the rush of speed and power came shadowed by a fuel gauge sinking faster than anyone had bargained for. On paper, the figures dazzled, yet every mile drank more oil than the last, and the expense, masked for now by cheap post-war contracts, hung as a nagging doubt in every engineer's head. Sherman Hill had fallen to the turbine, but at a cost that would soon grow impossible to overlook. Within the Ogden shops of Union Pacific, the turbine's bright promise soon soured into a daily slog. A punishing cycle of inspections, blade swaps, and emergency fixes greeted the mechanics. The turbine's core, that spinning hot section, gave out sooner than anyone had counted on. Loaded with ash and grit, Bunker C fuel gnawed through turbine blades on every trip. Rather than lasting months, certain blades came away deeply pitted and cracked after just weeks on the main line. Recalling those days, Ogden's lead foreman described crews tearing turbines apart after barely 10,000 miles. Since diesel units could cover 5 times that far before needing heavy work, spare parts turned into an endless nuisance. Fresh blades and nozzles had to ship in directly from General Electric's industrial division, frequently held up for weeks. Meanwhile, turbines sat useless in the shop bays awaiting deliveries as freight stacked up outside. The maintenance records lay it out plainly. In 1 month, 3 units were benched for want of filters. In the next, an entire batch waited on new combustor cans. Demand for spares ran ahead of what the supply chain could manage, and each holdup put yet another locomotive on the shelf. Many of the shop hands, schooled on steam or diesel, wound up picking up jet engine repair as they went. Specialized tooling, unfamiliar procedures, and regular safety drills became routine. Scorched overalls and burned gloves showed up often, above all when men were thawing fuel lines or unclogging jammed atomizers. For each hour the turbines roared over Wyoming, an hour or more vanished into the shop chasing the newest bout of wear. What emerged was a fleet formidable on paper yet, in practice, barely able to keep to the rails. As the 1950s wound down, the servicing load grew too heavy to overlook. Turbines meant to be moving freight over the Rockies instead sat benched for weeks running, held up for parts or repairs. Under the stark glare of the Ogden roundhouse, the dream of a low-upkeep, high-power future dimmed, for their reliability came down not to horsepower, but to how many engines could truly answer the bell each morning. Union Pacific's gas turbines earned headlines. Yet out along the main line, they delivered nearly as much grief as glory. Right away, the towns strung along the Wasatch Front and out in the high desert felt the change. Heavy with black smoke and unburned fuel, the turbine's exhaust drifted across farmland and neighborhoods. When mornings turned cold, the soot came to rest on laundry, on crops, and on cars parked near the rails. Papers in Ogden and Salt Lake City ran letters of complaint, and now and then city councils leaned on Union Pacific to reroute the turbines or hold back their runs during weather inversions. People's tolerance frayed, all the more as word spread of youngsters coming home smelling of oil and gardens left black with dust after a train passed. Out of public view, railroad managers set these grievances against the steady march of the diesels. Powerful as the turbines were, they worked within tight limits. Only certain routes suited them, the long straight runs where blistering speed and heavy tonnage earned back their thirst. The diesels, by contrast, fanned out quietly over the whole system. From mainline hauling to yard switching, they did it all, working round the clock with hardly any downtime. Any division shop could service a diesel, drawing on parts and skills shared throughout the trade. Turbines, though, called for their own dedicated shops, special training, and a reliable flow of scarce components. To Union Pacific's accountants, the monthly ledgers made the gap obvious. Diesel power ran dependably at a lower cost per mile, and its adaptability let the railroad shift with changing traffic. As the 1960s pressed on, the money argument tilted harder toward diesel. Once heralded as the future, the turbines curdled into a wellspring of operating trouble and public relations strain. In the end, it was the quiet, steady diesel that proved to be the engine keeping the railroad moving everywhere the tracks led. A reckoning fell on Union Pacific's turbine fleet in the winter of 1973. When oil prices shot up on the heels of the Middle East crisis, the price of running a gas turbine locomotive climbed overnight. Finance department memos laid the figures out in plain black and white. Every gas turbine locomotive had seen its cost per mile more than double inside 6 months. All at once, the bunker sea oil that had once looked like a steal now threatened to sink every long-haul run into the red. A directive came down on December 18th from the railroad's Omaha headquarters, calling for the whole turbine roster to be mothballed at once. Its wording was blunt and irreversible. Not one more fuel tender was to be topped off, and not one more turbine was to head west out of Cheyenne. Across yards throughout the system, dozens of locomotives, a few of them under 15 years old, were pulled from service, still streaked with soot from their final runs. Behind closed doors, finance and operations men tallied the losses, weighing storage costs against what the steel might fetch as scrap. Having once gambled on jet-age power, the decision-makers now met a grim truth. A running turbine was draining the company dry, and no relief was coming from the market. Not with a grand send-off, but with one irreversible stroke of the ledger, the age of the big blow came to its close. In Union Pacific's yards, rows of gas turbine locomotives stood idle, their enormous frames streaked with oil and soot, awaiting an end that arrived fast and without any ceremony. In came the salvage crews with torches and cutting rigs, laboring through winter and into spring to break the fleet apart. Within a few years of retirement, most of the 55 turbines had been cut to scrap. Steel and copper went off by the ton, turbine blades were melted, and the cabs were gutted of their controls and glass. Company records show that almost every unit disappeared off the roster somewhere between 1971 and 1974. Their serial numbers struck through in the maintenance logs and the asset ledgers. When it was all over, just 2 turbines had dodged the torch. One ended up at Ogden's Utah State Railroad Museum, while the second went to the National Museum of Transportation over in St. Louis. For the rest, there was no drive to preserve them, no commemorative plaque, no final run for the public to see. From company newsletters and rail fan magazines, the turbine's story simply faded. Even inside museums, they sit as curiosities, seldom feted and rarely recounted. One Ogden curator called the turbine a relic stripped of nostalgia, too modern to romanticize, too fleeting to become legend. All the others slipped away into the hush of forgotten ambition. These days, as railroads reach for new kinds of power, from hydrogen to self-driving engines, the moral holds. Technology only pays off when it answers the demands of the real world. The gas turbine story warns that grand promises can evaporate against economics and hard practicality. In any industry, the next big thing sits forever, one trial away from being forgotten. So, what's your take? Are we repeating history, or at last learning from it?